At the age of 93, Angie Dickinson is talking about Randolph Scott. She has not said anything about him for then 70 years. For a time, Angie Dickinson kept a big secret about Hollywood. Now she is one of the people still alive from that time. Angie Dickinson thinks it is more important to tell the truth than to keep stories going. What Angie Dickinson says about Randolph Scott is very surprising. Randolph Scott was an actor who starred in over 100 movies. What Angie Dickinson reveals about Randolph Scott makes people think differently about him. According to Dickinson, Scott's public image was not just carefully managed, it was completely made up. Scott was shown to the world as the American man, a tough cowboy who stood for being strong, independent, and having old-fashioned values. Behind the scenes, at the movie studio, Dickinson says, things were really different. Scott was living two lives, and one of them could have ruined Scott's career if people had found out about it. Scott's double life was a secret. It could have hurt Scott's reputation if it had become public. The thing that really got people talking was Scott's relationship with Cary Grant. They were really close for a long time. From 1932 to 1944, Scott and Cary Grant lived together in a house by the beach in Santa Monica. The newspapers said they had a bachelor arrangement, which is a nice way of saying they lived together. The movie studios said they were friends who split the bills. Dickinson says that everyone in Hollywood knew that Scott and Cary Grant were more than just friends. She remembered that people did not talk about it then. If two men were living together, you just did not say anything. Everyone knew what was going on with Scott and Cary Grant. Dickinson came to Hollywood in 1953 as a face, and people told her the rules. An older actress took her aside in the cafeteria, said, "Do not talk about some stars if you want to keep your job." They told her Randolph Scott was one of those stars. You had to be quiet about these things. You would be in trouble. The people in charge made sure everyone was quiet. Dickinson had to be careful what she said about Randolph Scott. The movie studios worked hard to keep Scott's reputation clean. They made sure he was seen with actresses, they put stories in the newspapers, and they planned every time he went out in public. Scott and his friend Grant were even pushed into getting married to make people stop talking about their relationship. Grant got married 5 times. Scott got married twice, including a long-time marriage to Patricia Stillman that started after he and Grant stopped living together. The person talking about this, Dickinson, thinks that the timing of Scott's marriage to Patricia Stillman was not a coincidence. Scott and Grant were very careful about what people thought of them, and the movie studios helped them keep their image clean. What really got to Scott was the way he had to live his life. It was very hard for him. He always had to be careful about what he said and did. Scott was always a little distant and tense. When he was at work or out in public, he was always putting on a show. He was not just acting for the cameras, he was acting for everyone around him. He was acting all the time, even when the cameras were not filming, she said. Scott's situation was painful because he had to play a role all the time. This kind of acting is really bad for Scott. It takes a lot out of him to be acting like this. People around Scott felt it too. The thing about Scott was that he had this wall around him. Nobody dared cross it. The people who worked with Scott, like the crew members and the actors who were in the movie, as Scott, they all knew what not to talk about. Dickinson says that one time an actor made a joke about Scott and Grant. It was not a deal, just a little joke. The next day, that actor was told his contract was not going to be renewed. Nobody said why. Everyone who worked with Scott knew what it meant. Scott was someone you did not want to mess with. The climate of fear was really bad, according to Dickinson. This was because Scott was not a famous movie star. Scott was a cultural symbol. Scott was a hero in movies during the 1940s and 1950s, when people were very conservative. At that time, Scott represented what people thought a real American man should be like. The movie studios did not want to lose money. They also did not want to ruin the idea of Scott that people loved and believed in. Years later, Dickinson and Scott met again at an event for people in their line of work. They had both much stopped being in the public eye by then. They did not really talk. They looked at each other, and that was enough. His eyes were saying something to her. They were saying, "You know what happened." Her eyes were saying back to Dickinson, "Yes, I know, and that is okay." Dickinson said this was the truthful moment she ever had with Scott. So the story of Dickinson is really interesting because it tells us a lot about Hollywood. The movie studios picked the roles that Scott would play carefully. They usually put him in movies where he did not have to talk a lot. This was good for Scott because he was a person. The studios wanted people to think that Scott was strong and serious. When Scott did interviews, he was given a script to follow. The people who interviewed him were also given questions that they had to ask. Even the women who went to events with Scott were sometimes paid to be. The studios wanted to make sure that everything about Scott's life looked perfect. They did not want anything to happen by accident. The story of Dickinson shows us how old Hollywood really worked. Dickinson thinks that Scott knew he was stuck in a situation. She recalls seeing times when Scott was not acting like himself, when his face would show his feelings, but only for a second. Then he would put his mask on because he knew people were looking at him. Dickinson said that Scott had something inside of him. The movie studios made sure that nobody ever got to see what Scott was like. So what does Emily Dickinson really show us in the end? It is not the story of one man, but the story of Hollywood and the entire system that is based on things that are not real. The golden age of Hollywood, Emily Dickinson says, was not really about what's true, but about keeping people believing in fantasies no matter what. Randolph Scott, who people loved as a cowboy hero, was one of the examples of this, and also one of the people who got hurt by it the most. Hollywood and the entire system built on illusion. That is what Emily Dickinson is talking about. The people who tried to mess with the image of Hollywood usually got in big trouble. Dickinson talked about people called fixers who made sure problems went away. They did this by paying people to be quiet, by scaring them, or by making up stories to take attention away from the real problems. This system worked well because it was everywhere at the same time. The big movie studios had a lot of control over the careers of Hollywood actors because of the contract they signed. The way people in Hollywood lived and thought also made actors feel like they had to fit in and not cause any trouble. Hollywood was a place where people had to be careful what they did, else they might face serious consequences from the Hollywood system. The people around them at that time did not like anything that was different from what they thought was normal. It was not the movie studios that felt this way, as Dickinson said. The newspapers, the people in general, and even the government felt the way. Everyone wanted to keep thinking that everything was okay, and the movie studios were the ones making sure this idea was kept alive. The movie studios were in charge of making people believe these things. What makes Emily Dickinson's perspective so powerful is that Emily Dickinson experienced this system from both inside and at a distance. Emily Dickinson was part of this system, yet not so trapped by this system that Emily Dickinson could not see how dishonest this system was. Emily Dickinson came into this system, Emily Dickinson said, as this system was beginning to weaken, which allowed Emily Dickinson to notice the cracks that other people either could not see or were too afraid to acknowledge. From this point of view, Emily Dickinson saw how much this system cost people, like Randolph Scott. The man people thought was really honest and fair was actually living a lie. Dickinson would often think about how hard it must have been for him to deal with that. She said that the longer this went on, the more he became the character the movie studios had made for him until the real man was gone. Dickinson thought about this a lot. She felt bad for the man. The man had to keep acting like someone he was not. That was really tough for him. Scott, she thinks, finally realized that the way people saw him was like being in jail. He kept being the person people expected him to be even after he stopped working. By that time, she thinks Scott himself had a time knowing what was real and what was not. When Scott played a role for many years, it got really hard for him to know who he really was and who he was pretending to be. The bad things that happened because of this acting did not stop when Scott stopped working. Scott had to deal with these problems for a time. This thing had an impact on the way he related to other people, the way he thought about himself, and how he lived his life. It really affected him until the day he died. The way he interacted with people, his sense of self, and his daily life were all influenced by this thing for long as he lived. Dickinson also says that the relationship between Scott and Cary Grant shows us a truth about Hollywood's golden age. This story is not special, it is one of the more famous examples. Hollywood is an industry that is built on making things look perfect even if they are not. There are two Hollywoods, one that everyone sees and another that only some people know about. Movie stars often have to play two parts: the character they play in movies and the person they pretend to be in public, and who they really are is hidden behind both of these parts. The relationship between Scott and Cary Grant is an example of this. Hollywood's golden age was a time when this was very common. The studio system did not just make movies, Dickinson said. It made a different world. The people in charge of publicity were always coming up with stories about the movie stars. They would say that two stars were in love, or they would set them up on dates. They even helped people get married. It was not always because the people were in love. It was because it was good for business. The studio system did this kind of thing all the time. The studio system did not think about how these things affected the people involved. The studio system only thought about what would make money. The movie stars were part of the studio system, and the studio system controlled what they did. Dickinson said that the studio system was like this. For Scott, this meant a long time of not being honest about who Scott really was. Dickinson thought that when someone denies who they are for long, it hurts them very badly, and the pain lasts forever. As time went on, Scott became more and more withdrawn, did not let people see how Scott felt. There was a feeling about Scott, it was not super obvious, but it was always there, like Scott had given up on some things in life that would never happen for Scott. To keep himself safe, Scott started to choose roles that did not require Scott to show a lot of feelings, so Scott hid behind characters that people knew well. She thought that people did not get to see how good of an actor he really was. The world missed out on seeing the depth of the actor that he was capable of being. Dickinson thought that Scott was a thoughtful and gentle person. He was also very perceptive. Sometimes, when Scott was not being careful, Dickinson saw a side of him. She saw that he wasn't a funny person. He was also very kind. Not many people got to see this side of Scott. These moments did not last long. Dickinson said that the best way to be safe is to keep people at a distance. When you are hiding something about yourself, you can never really feel calm or trust people. Dickinson felt that Scott was hiding something. That is why he kept people away. Scott was a person, and Dickinson only saw glimpses of his real personality. Scott knew what he had done. He gave up being real for a career and for people to like him. She saw him at an awards show when someone said he was an example of being honest. For a moment she saw something in his face that was not sadness, but a quiet feeling that things are not what they seem. Scott knew more than anyone how different he really was from the person people thought he was. He knew the difference between the way he appeared and what was actually true about him, about Scott. That is why Dickinson thinks the real sad thing about Scott's life was that he could not be himself openly. He had to tell people to be away even though he was not allowed to be that way himself. This was very hurtful to Scott because people saw him as an honest person, but he was not really able to be true and honest. This hurt Scott deeply, and it never went away. Scott's life was a tragedy because of this. People often ask why Dickinson decided to talk after being quiet for so long. Dickinson would not have felt talking about it when Scott was still alive, or even for a while after he passed away. As time went on, things changed. At some point, Dickinson thinks that it is more important to tell the truth about what happened than to keep old secrets hidden. This is not just about Scott and one other man. It is about understanding the system that affected culture and many people's lives by being dishonest. Dickinson wants people to know about this system. She feels like she has to talk about what she saw because she was actually there. When the people who lived through that time are no longer around, all we will have are the stories. She wants to make sure that people remember what really happened. She thinks that people today can listen to these stories without being mean, but with kindness instead. Things that people used to be ashamed of can now be understood because we know what was going on then. She believes that today's society is able to hear these stories with compassion, than judgment, and that is why she wants to share her experiences. What she saw and experienced is a part of that history. She wants to make sure that people understand it. For Emily Dickinson, knowing the whole story of Scott's life does not make him any less of a person. It actually makes what Scott did more amazing. To have a career like Scott's while keeping a secret all the time took a lot of strength and determination. Her goal is not to make a deal out of Scott's life, but to show the real Scott and give him back the dignity that Scott was not able to have when Scott was alive. In the end, Dickinson's reflections offer more than the clarification of old rumors. They reveal the human cost of Hollywood's golden age. Behind the glamour were real people forced to live within rigid boundaries, often at great personal expense. By speaking now, she hopes to give Randolph Scott something he was never allowed to have while he lived, the simple dignity of being seen as he truly was.